Well, hey man, thank you for being willing to sit down and chat with me. I'm not sure.
Thanks for the invite. I think it's going to be fun. I don't know much about you. I
Yeah, I was
just
gonna say.
saw
Well,
your quick description that you said you were in a situation similar to that of Jordan, so that sounded interesting.
I don't know if that's overselling myself a little bit, but I at least really appreciated and have identified with a lot with his journey
Yeah.
here, kind of trying to understand Christianity and makes. I mean, like, I mean, I've read all. I think I've read all of his current books. I haven't finished his new one yet, but I mean,
Hmm.
knowing a bit of his backstory, just knowing that like he kind of grew up in somewhat Christian circles and like kind of had some
Yeah.
exposure to that, and then like as he starts, thinking about the world and trying to develop his own worldview, I really relate to that process of just like, okay, I can't actually make sense of the way I was handed spirituality when I was a kid, not with my, worldview or lack thereof now.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's a common arc, I guess, nowadays. Like Jordan has lived it in a very, let's say, condensed or intense kind of way. But
yeah,
yeah, I don't know. It maybe half of the people now have like some
I've
degree of experience in
exactly.
that story.
It seems to be pretty universal story of almost every young person who's interested in thinking, I guess, either has just left the church altogether or has found us Jordan Peterson. And
Yeah.
then it's like he's been just sort of a touchstone of like, oh well, at least I can. This is something. I guess this makes me at least think about it again. I'm still not quite sure what to do with it, but it makes me think it's important again.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there are people who have gone back in other ways, but it's always a similar kind of move of like it's always some reenchantment kind of move. You
Yeah,
reach sort of
reenchantment.
the end of modern thinking somehow, like you keep decomposing things down into their constituent parts, and at some point you just can't keep producing anymore, and then you flip back to something else. And different people have been doing that for a while, but
Right.
like it hasn't been catching on as much as it does now, I guess. Like
Yeah, I
with
don't think it's necessarily a totally new story arc that people have just suddenly, they've got to the end of modernism and then realized, oh, I need some sense of spiritualism to make sense of the world. Like that seems, with kind of my brother and a couple of friends, we were doing a little book club and we were reading even Don Quixote, which
Mhm.
that was like the 1700s. And it's like, it seems like the same conversation is happening there where it's like they've kind of, there's a frustration with the hypernaturalism or hyper realist perspective on reality. It's like it doesn't mean anything once you've removed all the meaning. And
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
what are you going to do with that? And then that's where you get this Don Quixote character, where he's just like he's the guy who's gone crazy because of essentially because of lack of meaning, and then he starts like hyper focusing on meanings and patterns and painting everything as if it's way more meaningful than it is. And it becomes this I mean, it's a very silly story, but it's like, but reading that narrative, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a conversation that's been happening, you know, it's probably been happening since thousands of years ago, but like,
Yeah.
it's an
Yeah.
arc that keeps repeating, and there's a sense of which you don't feel quite so alone when you read something like that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
The story just gets more intense or more shared across time, it seems. Like it wasn't as widespread, I think, if you go back to 200 to 300 years ago. But yeah, now, as you said earlier, it seems like every young person or just about has this story inside them. So
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, I'm interested to hear a little bit of more of like, because I've read some of your stuff.
Hmm.
I actually spent kind of the weekend listening through your conversation you had with John Vervake and
Hmm.
Paul Vanderklay. That was really
Hmm.
really good, and I wanted to even maybe spend some of the time today kind of following that up and seeing
Yep.
if you had developed some more thoughts after that conversation, because
Hmm.
that was good. But I mean,
Sure.
how did you get to the place where you're at now with faith and with philosophy? I mean, I know you
Hmm.
graduated. I'm not sure what school, but you graduated you have a degree in philosophy now, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I can tell the whole story fairly quickly. It's the kind of arc that you mentioned earlier, and can just fill in some details. So, I was raised Catholic, and Quebec is a very Catholic
Okay.
province. Uh, Fell away from it during my teenage years because didn't seem to have the same kind of, let's say, rigor as what I saw in school, and I was interested and I was doing well in the harder sciences, so that's what I went towards. I was especially interested by mathematical logic and like studying the structures of logic. And I was skeptical that you could go very far with this kind of stuff, but at least it seemed very solid. So I wanted to, okay, like it's not clear what good and evil are in this modern world. Like we're good at knowing material stuff, but we're not really good at knowing what to do with it. So I thought I should at least like spend some time to think about it before I like embark on a career or try to do something. Like I should think about like what's good, and like if there is such a thing, then like how can I do it? So I wasn't very convinced by the kind of philosophy that I saw at the time, but what I was learning in mathematics seemed so solid that I thought, okay, I'm gonna do mathematical logic. So I studied mathematics and computer science in my undergrad there, actually at McGill. So like the place you used to drive to, and yeah, I used to do the drive back and forth between Quebec and Montreal as well, fairly often for a while there. But yeah, during those studies, my hope to, let's say, approach questions of morality from within mathematics were just completely undercut by Gödel's incompleteness theorems. You've probably heard about it. I don't remember the details and like how the proof goes like in all of its details, but basically it shows that like as solid as mathematics seems, you still cannot show from within mathematics that your mathematical system is complete and consistent. Like any formal system you create will not be able to show its own consistency and completeness. Like basically the output of that is that you won't get that far with just mathematical logic or like any kind of logical system in general.
Is the argument it's based on, like, as I mean, it seems obvious to me that whenever you use a mathematical or some closed system to represent reality or some other larger open system, that you're going to reach an end to which that closed system is represented. But is the argument that even within the closed system, it can't represent itself?
Yeah, kind of. But I mean, but it came as a huge shock at the time in mathematics, because you have to remember like the social climate at the time, where like logical positivism was like well on its way. The sciences were making tons of progress, and like so was mathematics. So like there was a lot of momentum where people were expecting to sort of solve all of the world's problems with science and mathematics. But then a few small crises occurred. Like some people realized that some of their mathematical systems like had inconsistencies in them, so they were completely worthless. Because like you try to make proofs in mathematics to show that something is absolutely certain, and like some people had been using certain systems for decades, and then someone would show, oh look, I can show that 1 equals -1, and your system is incorrect. So like you would like people would flip out, and people would realize that, oh well, actually if you take out one of Euclid's axioms, like that people have been taking for granted for like 2,000 years, if you take that out, actually you can still get some pretty interesting things. So like things were starting to get tipsy-turvy for logical positivism. And then people had a great idea to show from within mathematics that mathematics is complete and consistent. And I don't know in how much detail it's worth going, but yeah, I think we can talk about more interesting stuff. So I'm not going to go into the complete detail, but basically like David Hilbert, some people had like really nice insights about how to talk about mathematics within mathematics, because mathematics is about manipulating symbols. So if you talk about mathematics using symbols, well, you can manipulate them using symbols. So like you get this self-recursive thing, and like it seemed really promising, and like across the board, mathematicians were super optimistic that they could finally like get to something like rock solid, and they wouldn't like face the tipsy-turvy stuff that they've been facing for the last decades. But Gödel, in trying to show that precisely what Hilbert was hoping for, in hoping to show that he had found a foundation for mathematics, he actually showed that it was impossible to find a foundation for mathematics. So it just completely destroyed every like all of their.
So your trajectory kind of followed like.
Yeah.
You followed mathematics to its end, or at least read the historical story of mathematics finding its own end, and that was what kind of what reintroduced you to the idea of God, or what?
But it was, I'd say that it was, let's say, the last straw towards like this hope of understanding the world like reductionistically, trying to reduce things down. I mean,
Right.
I see mathematics in a completely different way now. Like I'm more of a Platonist in mathematics, but like after like reaching the end of reductionistic thinking, I thought, well, I mean, I'm not gonna answer my questions from within mathematics. I should now spend some time to think about philosophy, and so I went and did a master's in philosophy, and I was more pessimistic than when I had entered mathematics. I thought, I mean, if I'm not even gonna get there with mathematics, like what are the hopes for philosophy anyway? But like actually, it turned out much better than I had expected. There are some modern philosophers who go into all kinds of weird directions, but but I think it's quite possible to start with a solid problem and try to find philosophers sort of around that problem who have given like good answers, and then like if there's still some hiccups, you look at the philosophers around them who have some good answers to those problems, and then I sort of worked my way through this web, and throughout all that I kept just discovering Christian philosophers and especially Catholic philosophers who had good answers to all of my questions. So like over time I took it more and more seriously. I learned about Jordan Peterson around that time through Jordan about Jonathan, and I had I had a chance to have several conversations with Jonathan. We've been speaking for a few years now, I would say, especially since we live in the same province.
Right.
We throughout all of those things, like I got back involved in my church because I saw that it was I could have some inklings that it was true, and then like once I had like ways in which I could see how it was true, then like I could actually go and practice. I was nowhere
Right.
near the point of like understanding even, I don't know, like 95% of it. Like I had a very low understanding of what was going on, but I had enough for it to be interesting,
Right.
like for it to be on a path for me. So I just embarked on that path, and like I mean, I'm gonna try it for a while. I don't have to stay forever, but like keeping on that track, and it just kept deepening and deepening, and I understood more and more. I met great people, made great friends, learned a great amount. Actually, I ended up going to a church where there are tons of philosophers. So I mean, I had tons of people to talk with. At some point,
like a rare find.
Went. I mean, it's rare. I think you have to find the right parishes. Yeah. But at some point, like the craziest thing was, I went one summer to do it was sort of a weekly meeting, a club where we would watch a video and then discuss it, and like it just happened that we were 4 philosophy students out of like 10 people there. And I didn't even know the other 3. Like I had seen their faces at the department, but we're not in the same year, so I didn't know them. But it just turned out that like we were 4 out of 10 in philosophy. So it
well, I mean,
just
if that doesn't make you convinced of providence.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I definitely really can relate to that, especially you're describing like initially entering back into trying to practice some form of Christianity. I feel like that's almost exactly where I am, where it's like there's something that seems very meaningful about Christianity, but I just really have no idea what I mean when I say I believe in God, or what I mean when I say I'm a Christian, because I don't, like, I mean, I can say I'm a Christian in the sense that, like, I want to be part of that religion and act out those patterns and do the things that Christians do. It's just that I mean, I guess I kind of want to get into some of this stuff. I even... to kind of follow up some of the conversations you were having already. And I mentioned that I wanted to try to even unpack a little bit of what Peterson and Pageau were talking about.
Yeah. It would be useful for me, I think, to know like where you're standing from at the moment. Like when let's say you say that you cannot say how you believe in God, what's the closest? Like what's your, let's say, approximation of what even God would be?
Well, I mean, I definitely find a lot of meaning in the idea of God being the pattern of patterns. Like, that's interesting. Although there it becomes sort of patriarchal, because it's like he's the father of fathers. But he's not just that. It's like he would be the very top and the bottom when it comes to that patterned reality. It's like he spans them. I guess that would be he's the first and the last, right? So it's like conceptually, that makes sense to me, that I need to have a concept for those things in order to grasp reality. And so sometimes to me, I guess it's like I'm at least willing to, or it's like I'm convinced of it's absolutely necessary to believe and to have access to a category called God. But I don't necessarily know to what extent God is personal, or I think it kind of even just goes into the question about what consciousness looks like on a higher level. Because it's interesting. Recently, my friend Andrew was he was part of a Q&A with Jonathan was doing on Facebook, and he asked that question, like, what does consciousness look like on a higher level? And Jonathan answered with an answer I've heard him use before, talking about like a city. But I mean, the more interesting and more difficult answer to that question that I really want to know kind of goes into, and I think I read a little bit that you were and focused on panpsychism, and I'm not sure what form of that you've kind of done some study on, but I think that leads us into some of the questions we need to. And fortunately, though, here I want to make sure we don't get too off in the clouds. I have my brother here listening too, and I'm not a philosopher. I like philosophy, and so I guess I want this conversation to be accessible to everybody, whether they're totally interested or they've done, some of the reading that you have or I have or not. So if anything doesn't make sense, he's going to keep us grounded here and stop us.
You already dropped the term panpsychism, and I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I was just about to go over that anyways, or maybe you could even give a better definition, because I mean I watched a short video the other day on a couple different forms of it, like I mean, categorically the ones I wrote down, there's animism, there's pantheism, there's panprotopsychism, pancognitivism. So
there's a bunch of like panpsychisms re-emerging in the recent decades, mainly because it's the same pattern as what we talked about earlier, like going to the end of reductionism, and at some point you realize that there's some things that we cannot reduce and they're still part of the world, so we need to make space for them somehow. And one of the big stopping points for reductionism is consciousness. There are others, but like one of the biggest ones is consciousness, because it really does not seem plausible to reduce our consciousness to something smaller, let's say, to some material atoms or whatever. People were trying for a while, but more and more people in philosophy of mind and cognitive science are adopting non-reductionistic accounts of consciousness. And one of the theories that has been coming back is panpsychism. So the idea in panpsychism is it's really elegant. The idea is, okay, if you, Garrett, are a complex set of particles, I can think about you as a complex set of particles, of however many particles governed by like very complex probabilistic laws. And like if we're listening to the physicists, you can even, like, if you had a good enough computer, you could calculate the probability distributions of what Garrett will do using that description of Garrett. But if you look just at that, actually it's an empty description of what Garrett is. It just gives you Garrett's behavior, but it never tells you what Garrett is in himself. That never tells you like the reasons for that behavior, because by design,
so it has to do with reasons, not just causes. And that was something you guys were talking about as well, is the difference between a cause and a reason.
It's not actually exactly the same issue as what we were discussing with John there. In John, with that discussion with Paul, we did not need panpsychism. It was like just about Neoplatonism, basically. But I can try to close the loop with panpsychism, and then I can make my way back to Neoplatonism. Because like just to keep going on the insight for panpsychism is, like, if you look at anything that physical science describes, it always only describes how the thing behaves. It never describes its nature. You'll know, for instance, that an electron follows a certain set of laws, but you'll never know what the electron is in itself. You know that even if you say that the electron...
Okay, so I'm getting lost here, because what do you mean when you're talking about what something is in itself other than its behavior? Because to me, especially listening to Peterson's idea of, or I mean, going in, I guess maybe that's the philosophy of, what would you say? Oh, crap. It's Heidegger. What are those guys called
that's
again?
Phenomenology.
Phenomenology, right? Phenomenology is like basically something is what its function is. Isn't that essentially, or
it's not going to be behavior though, because in phenomenology, you won't deny the fact that there is a felt sense of let's say if you see the function of something, if I see a pair of glasses, for instance, like it's true that I see because of the function of the glasses, like I constrain, there are too many details in those glasses. There's too much stuff. There's a combinatorial explosion of aspects of molecules of whatever that I could see in the glasses. And if it's actually something we have to learn, but if I see the purpose of the glasses, if I see them as something I can put on to see like such a distance or to shield me from the sun or whatever, if once I get to grab those functions, then the chaos of the glasses like is turned into something. I will perceive like the essence of the glasses, you could say. I'll perceive them as something I can see through, for instance. Like they turn from potential into a pattern.
Right.
But this is a different way of seeing things from Panpsychism. Like we're again going towards something else. So there's like Neoplatonism, which we talked about earlier. There's Panpsychism, and then there's like phenomenology, which Jordan brings up. So I'm not. Yeah, there are many branches. Don't know which one you would prefer to go into.
Well, yeah. To me, I guess I'm trying to resolve them a little bit because the phenomenology makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, my understanding, and again, my brief kind of trek through trying to understand just almost a definition of panpsychism was just like, okay, it includes animism, it includes, I mean, there's various forms, and obviously it doesn't, identifying as a panpsychist doesn't mean that you're an animist, but it's just that's one form of panpsychism.
Yeah.
But so I mean, like thinking about the idea of consciousness existing on the level of a like a god type being and of a human type being. Well, I mean, this is something I wanted to go into. Is what would be the difference between the kind of consciousness that a god can have, or that I could have, or that a rock could have?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's good. It gives me a telos to try and like.
Yeah. Okay.
Like to try and like trim down on the possibilities of what we could go towards. So the basic idea in panpsychism is like you want some kind of continuity between our consciousness up and down the chain of being. So for human consciousness to exist, let's say from an assemblage of neurons, well, you need something like consciousness in those neurons, and like so on all the way down, and even all the way up, probably, like in the way that people can like join together in groups.
Right. Well, I mean, I was talking to my wife the other day about marriage, and I mean that's a very Christian idea of that you become one flesh, and it's like it's not that like when you're doing something in your marriage that you're doing something and you're part of the marriage. It's like the marriage is doing something. It's its own being to some extent.
Yeah. So this idea that there is a continuity in consciousness up and down the chain of being has been coming back in philosophy of mind to try and answer the mind-body problem, because like consciousness doesn't just come out of nowhere. Then it's part of the world, like up and down. So, but I think I hear some echo now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Do you hear it?
I don't, but I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure how to fix it. Either if you want to take a headphone off for a little bit until it goes away, it should disappear at some point.
Well, it's not that big a deal for me as I'm speaking, but I just don't want it to pollute the recording. But I guess on your end, it's fine.
You want to move the mouse, Evan? I think he got it on his face.
Okay.
But I think we okay for recording, but yeah. So it's consciousness up and down.
Yeah, up and down the chain of being. So now, you have one problem though. Like the question is, okay, like do we have some sort of criteria for our consciousnesses can combine? Because it's not clear at first sight. Let's say how my human consciousness is made up of smaller consciousnesses, or how, let's say, the consciousness of you and your wife can combine into one overarching consciousness. That stuff is not obvious at first sight, but like there are some insights which Jordan gives that can be useful, I think. For instance, if you notice that you're made up of subpersonalities, you can see how they cohere into one consciousness, and you can see how you're made up of smaller subconsciousnesses. Like you have all kinds of passions, which like want different things, and we exist on a sort of lower in time scale.
Yeah.
You can notice it, especially in dramatic events. Let's say if you have a car accident, you'll see that you get pulled into different directions by different subpersonalities. Like part of you wants to run away, part of you wants to go help the other person, but part of you wants just to freeze. Like, and what you do is from all of those potentialities, from those subpersonalities, you will constrain them, and you'll select like just one of them. From the possibilities that you have, you'll constrain it. You'll constrain yourself down to one, and it's the same kind of thing that happens in a family. So, if let's say you and your wife become one person in one marriage, like you have to constrain both of your possibilities, both of your personalities down into just one structure. There are things that you will not do, even if you're alone by yourself. There are things that you will not do because of the marriage. Like it will have a top-down influence on you. And in the same way that your consciousness is on a higher time scale than the one of your passions, of your subpersonalities, then if you think about the consciousness of your marriage, for instance, it's going to be on a higher time scale. It's going to be in a, I don't know if it's like official doctrine, but let's say you can say that once you get married, there's a sacrament there. There's kind of an angel there. There's a higher level pattern that has been established that will govern the life of you and your wife. So, and we have this idea of, let's say, I would have to check if, like, if I could find some doctrine about this on marriages, but I know that there is for sure, like, about parishes. Like if you have a certain church, this church has an angel. Like there's a pattern to the church that will govern how it will behave. Like the different people won't behave just any which way when they come to the church, and even it will not be exactly like the other churches down the road. Like there's one personality to this church, and it exists at the higher time scale, because I mean your neurons fire like 25 times a second, but the church fires like once a week or something like that. So of course the time scale changes.
So
but
and so if we kind of accept that becomes a form of consciousness, then do we also start to accept, as sort of softer versions of consciousness, which is like right now there's a new consciousness that just happened when you and I met, and now there's our relationship, which is like it's almost like a weak pattern because it hasn't really established what it is yet, right?
Yeah.
But it's like a very soft.
Yeah, it's sort of trying to emerge. It's like people with like split personalities, like who are not very unified. But I mean, sometimes with some people you can feel that you really like become really close and like arguably like one person.
You're in sync.
It's easier obviously in person, and if you're having a great conversation with someone, that happens. Like you sort of both lose yourself in the conversation.
Right.
We'll even say that, like you become one thing. Yeah. You're just informed by the conversation.
So Evan, are you tracking so far? Is this making sense?
Good, but it does sound a little mystical almost.
Yeah,
mystical. Connected into one when we first met, or whatever.
Yeah, and then if we can try going up that to try and answer your question you asked about earlier.
Well, I'm interested more to go down first, because
okay.
I want to talk about the consciousness of a rock.
Yeah, well, and most panpsychists will say that the rock itself doesn't have a consciousness, but they will say that its constituent particles and maybe atoms do. So it's a lot about the actions or the causal powers of a thing. So if, let's say, I look at a fundamental particle, let's say I look at an electron. An electron looks like it does things. Like it moves. It's attracted to some things. It's repelled by some other things. It looks like there's some like very simple desire there, like it's elementary. Like no panpsychist would ascribe any sort of complex consciousness to the electron, but panpsychists would generally hold that there has to be something very simple that it's like to be an electron. And I mean, this can sound surprising to people who hear this idea for the first time, but lots of people are taking it seriously in philosophy of mind, because if you don't do that, then you're gonna have a huge problem at some point trying to answer how it is that human consciousness like relates to the physical world.
You get the problem of borders of when, at what point do you decide it becomes consciousness, and what point is it not consciousness? Which I mean is kind of the argument Christians have been struggling with for a while when it comes to abortion, because I mean it was already like, okay, well, we're going to decide there's a time when it becomes a human person, like a being, and is that right the second that that a sperm penetrates an egg? Is it once it's like I don't know that much of the science behind it.
But I mean this one like it's so there's obviously a point where we start caring about the consciousnesses there. So we don't care about the electrons. We don't care about when the particles also combine in stuff that isn't conscious. So for instance, if you look at a chair, in a chair, you could see that, okay, it's electrons, for instance, or it's particles. They're moving, they're active, they're doing things. It looks like they have some small consciousnesses, and it makes sense. But when they combine into the overarching chair, it doesn't look like the chair as a whole is conscious. Like the consciousnesses do not combine. It's sort of like when we were talking about people earlier, when if, let's say, you're just in your room somewhere and I'm completely elsewhere and we're not talking, like our consciousness don't combine into anything. Like we're just completely different. And like the
'Cause they're not
consciousnesses of the
interacting.
particles in the chair would sort of be like that. They're besides one another, but they don't combine into anything.
Well, so
And
to me it seems like, okay, so as soon as that chair is being interacted with or interacting with something, then all of its constituent parts have to sort of make a decision. So then the chair has a consciousness again. It has to decide whether or not it's going to hold up the person that's going to sit on it, or if it's going to crumble, right? And that decision is made based on, you know, like the probability
I think most likely most panpsychists would answer that the decision isn't made at the level of the chair as a whole. It's probably made at a very low level. For instance, in the fact that if you take like two atoms of metal in the chair, the fact that they always hold like very close together, if you look at it at this level, it looks like they're doing something, like they're willing something. They're willing to stay close together, for instance. So at this level, you would say that like there is consciousness there in the atoms that hold together, but at the higher level, there's no action there, no willing. Sort of and it's actually important to have some kind of view of panpsychism like this, because it allows you to also explain why in our brains we're not always conscious. Like we have studies on this kind of stuff where there are regions of your brain that are more conscious than others. Like there are some patterns of activations of your neurons that are conscious and some that are not. For instance, like at the back of your mind, you have tons of neurons. Like you have actually more than in your prefrontal cortex, but it's very lowly action. There's very little relationship between consciousness and like this back part of your brain. Whereas in the front part, you have fewer neurons, but it's very closely related to consciousness. Like if you ask people, let's say you see some part of their brain is activated when you scan them, and you ask them whether they're conscious or not. Like you do this kind of stuff, and you see that it's more the prefrontal cortex that is associated with consciousness than the back part.
But that might be just sort of a frontal cortex bias, though, because I'm reading a little bit of the Master and His Emissary right now, or I've just started reading the first couple chapters, and he talks about how there's sort of there's at least three basically conversations happening in your brain. There's the front back conversation, top bottom conversation, and left right conversation between like, and it always comes to like the more specific and the more general or more potential. Right, which I mean that pattern is something that's very talked about a lot in the kind of symbolic world community. But like,
I don't remember that part of the book. I read it a while ago. I just focused on like the left and right brain
I mean,
stuff.
it was just a brief passing thing that he mentioned. I think maybe even in the introduction, but that stuck with me. It's like, oh, that's interesting because you have your subcortical activity, and right.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to the example because it's like this
classic
stuff that's used in panpsychism, just so I can try and close that too, because the basic idea will be that there are certain patterns that are not activated with consciousness as much as some others, and generally it's going to have a lot to do with like the complexity in the action that something can do. So some networks combine into stuff that is not very active, like the chair, for instance, whereas some other networks combine into things that are very active, like when you have a conversation and like people become one in the conversation. So it can, like in the same way that you can explain why the chair is not conscious but a human person is, like it's going to be like useful to explain some other questions, like how is it that a group can be conscious or whatever. And even like when you brought up abortion earlier, it's going to have to do with this as well, where it's not going to be like even about so much the, let's say, the complexity of the brain in there. It's going to have to be also with like the relationships with other people, like when like the story of the person exists, like from conception, like there's a whole network that has causal power, and the person already exists even if that person doesn't completely manifest. So I mean, to make it more concrete, let's say if people lose a baby, even if like it's maybe just a week in the womb or something like that, people can still be devastated because the story dies. Like people can tell that there was something there, like it was still quite in potential, like it wasn't fully manifest, but there was still something there with a lot of causal power, and we recognize it because people are like really saddened if
Yeah.
this person dies. So it like you have to look not just, let's say, at the individual reduction to something, but also at like the whole network. In the same way that different people can become one, you have to look at how like this nexus in the conception, let's say, fits within a broader network. So I just wanted to close all of those loops. I hope it helped. And
yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure I'm on the same page as you as far as the chair thing, because I mean, so you were talking about like, so even some relationships between people are not as active, and so it's almost like the consciousness is less so, or it's like it's non-existent. I don't know about the non-existent part. It just seems like you can only get more or less, but you can't really get to zero, because there's always at least a maybe very loose, maybe very distant connection, but all things are connected through the body of the universe, you know. So when it comes to, I guess I think we just need to define a little bit more clearly, and obviously nobody's been able to totally do this, but define a little bit more clearly what consciousness is. Is it just like at least, or it's like a larger amount of potential than a simple this will hold me or this won't? It has to be like able to sort of make decisions, like, and the decisions have to be able to vary a little bit, or like, so is potential and pattern, I guess, or
it's probably typically it's going to be about, well, most panpsychists would not formulate it exactly this way. Well, the big like point that people have been most talking about is phenomenal consciousness. So the what it's like to feel something or to do something, like the blue I see there, or the quality of the sound I feel in my ear, like those qualities, those phenomenal qualities, that's the aspect of consciousness that people are most concerned about. And if you look at it, let's say, with regards to potential and actuality, as you just said earlier, it's going to be about a right balance between the two, where you actually see this phenomenal consciousness. If you're just like completely in chaos, if you don't, if like there's only potential and there's nothing to actualize in there, you won't see anything. Like it won't feel like anything. It will just be sort of a chaotic void. And similarly, if there's like just order, if there's no potential to do, and like things are completely static, once again, it's also not going to feel like anything.
But the thing is that there's nothing that exists that is just order or just chaos or just potential. In order for it to exist at all and be a thing, it has to be constrained by, it has to be constrained, and it has to have potential. Those are the characteristics of things at all, right? And so,
well, yeah, I mean I think that's fine. If you, at that point, we can talk really more about, let's say, a kind of gradation of consciousness, where like there are layers, there are things that are barely conscious at all.
Well, so
and there are others
with that boundaries problem. That's where I kind of marry that thought I get from the phenomenology, is just that, like, okay, something becomes a different thing when it's the boundaries of what constitutes a chair and what's not the chair is like, what could I sit on? So the boundaries between what is consciousness and what is not consciousness might even change historically as philosophy develops or whatever, but it's just, it changes depending on how I could interact with that consciousness. Is it conscious enough, or is it close enough to my consciousness that I could understand it and I could meaningfully, that thinking about it in a consciousness would be useful to me. So I mean, that comes into just sort of a pragmatism, but like, I mean, so is that sort of make believe? Is that using a metaphor? And to what extent is anything not a metaphor then?
Well, I mean, if the issue, if you want to sort of talk with these kinds of, let's say, layers of, no, I shouldn't say layers. If you want to talk about these sort of gradations of consciousness, where some things are almost not conscious and some things are very conscious, if you want to talk about it this way, it's just that you're gonna have to use a lot of words to describe some stuff. Because I mean, right. If you want to say that, let's say the chair, before you interact with it, you're gonna have, rather than say that the chair is not conscious, like you're gonna have to say that it's barely conscious. And then like when you interact with it, rather than saying that, okay, I'm conscious of the chair because like in that relationship between the chair and I'm doing most of the heavy lifting of like bringing it into consciousness. You're gonna have to say probably something like, okay, like the chair is barely conscious. When I look at it, it becomes a lot more conscious because I'm doing a lot of, like, do you see?
Or
Like,
it becomes
what I think?
conscious to me, or at least
Yeah.
from a useful perspective, from my perspective. But
Yep.
again, in order, and that's you get to a problem of. See, I was thinking earlier today that every time you use the word really, I think you're sneaking in a form of realism. When you say, but it's really not this. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day where he was saying, like, okay, something you learn through meditation is that, you get over your ego and realize that you're not really yourself. You're really part of the universe. And it's like, no, you've just done the same trick of imagining self, but now you've imagined yourself as being as big as the universe. Mm-hmm. As soon as you decide anything is a thing, you're constraining it by your own perception, but it's not necessarily objectively. Like, I guess that's sort of my question. Something I'm struggling with is are things objective, or are things just something that we sort of subjectively map onto the world in order to be able to interact with it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be both. Where
it does have to be both.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, like, your point about people saying really is interesting. It seems like it's because people want to focus on just like one layer of being at a time. So, right. Like, I'm obviously, I'm both potential and form. I'm potential and I'm also patterned. Yeah. I cannot say that I'm really potential or that I'm really patterned, because really I'm both of those layers. Yeah. So, okay, so like classically, and I'm gonna veer off slightly from panpsychism. What happens basically if you go with the panpsychist idea of, okay, how is it that different consciousnesses can combine or fragment or whatever? You end up bringing in a lot of Neoplatonism, because Neoplatonism is a great philosophy to look at how things combine or fragment, how you can have patterns that bring potential together. And like, this has been very well developed throughout the history of the West until we like threw it away basically like after the Middle Ages and people tried to be reductionistic. But like Neoplatonism is coming back in many ways because it's answering a lot of problems, and including the fact of like, trying to understand, like, are things really, like, are they real in themselves? Are they real because I'm looking at them? Are they like just atoms? Are they patterns? Like, how do all of those layers and like persons interact together in the world? And I think there are great answers really to this. If you look at traditional thinkers, basically, like, a great way to see the world is as layers of potential and patterns. So I think it's simple, really, to start from the very bottom. If you look at what's going on the bottom layer of physics,
I especially like laying out layers of matter and pattern. Because I said I especially like forming it as there's layers of matter and pattern, not just because there's there's a symmetry.
But it's good. It's good. It's good that you mentioned that, because I've been using matter in the traditional sense for so long that I don't realize that it's very different from what people often hear about it. For the Greeks, I mean, for people up until like Descartes, I don't know, matter used to be potential.
Right.
Prime matter, what exists at the bottom layer of the world, is just potential. And indeed, if you do physics, that's what you're going to find there. Like, there's not even math there. It's just potential. Things that can be actualized into things.
Right.
And so you have matter, you have like prime potential at the bottom of things, and then you have patterns that can inform that matter. So like, you can have particles that will pop up. You have patterns. I mean, we can study those patterns. We have laws that explain to us like how electrons and different fundamental particles can pop out of potential. And so what you have there is you have potential meeting patterns and creating things. Like, so things are a meeting of potential and patterns. And it's true at all layers of being. And people have been bringing this up in different sciences and philosophy of science to try and explain how it is that you can jump from one science to the other.
Right.
So when, let's say, atoms jump together into molecules that chemists will study, you jump from physics to chemistry. And when you do that, actually, we have not like reduced chemistry to physics by no means. Like, it doesn't seem to really work this way. What's the best way to talk about it really is that when atoms combine together, you'll see the emergence of something new that is informed by higher level patterns. So for instance, the classic example is water and oxygen and hydrogen. If you look at oxygen and hydrogen, like they're gases at room temperature. Like oxygen allows us to like breathe. Hydrogen is flammable. Like they're these kinds of gases. If you combine them together, they become water, which is a liquid, completely different, and it can hydrate us, allow us to live, and so on. So you have the emergence of new causal powers. Like the potential of the oxygen and the hydrogen becomes informed by a pattern of water, and you have this meeting of water, an actual thing.
And you said you can't reduce chemistry to physics, so it actually starts playing by a different set of rules.
Yeah. I mean, it's continuous, but it's different. Like people have been trying to reduce chemistry to physics, and it really doesn't seem like it works. Even water, even like the example I just gave of like trying to reduce water to H2O doesn't actually work. It's like maybe you could say it's H2O on average. Really, like water is like there's a bunch of free oxygen and free hydrogen like all interacting together in complex ways, and it's from all of this mess that you have actual water. Like people haven't really reduced it, and
so there's some nature of water that seems to come in and inhabit those two gases and turn them into, right? I mean, is this kind of coming down to the nature thing of like what it really is?
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle would say a form. Like you have the form of water, the pattern of water, that is coming down and informing the oxygen and hydrogen.
Right.
So it's the same thing that happened at the bottom layer of physics. You have potential. You have like raw materials that get informed by some higher level pattern, and it's the same thing that happens
the process
at higher level.
Seems so confusing. Is just like and that's where sort of a version of dualism starts to be really useful, because it's like, okay, well, we exit the system and then we poke like this hand from the reality of chemistry reaches into physics and turns it into something, you know. It's like it's a miracle, right? That's what it seems like anyways.
But we don't want to be dualistic, because we want to say that this happens at all of the layers, because like you'll have the same thing again. I mean, you can say that the potential of the bottom layer of physics is potential relative to particles, which are potential relative to atoms, which are potential relative to molecules, which are potential relative to cells, which are potential relative to animals, which are potential relative to angels, like cities and marriages and so on, which are potential relative to like the entire cosmos, and the entire creation is. It gets tricky when you try to talk about God, because strictly speaking, God is beyond even potential. But go ahead.
So, so a consciousness is really, if we agree, it's sort of a gradient, and it just becomes most useful to think about consciousness as things most similar to our consciousness, because we're the observers and we're trying to talk about consciousness. But so when we talk about God's consciousness, is God more conscious, or is it an angel's consciousness? Is it more conscious or less conscious than than us?
Yeah, the classical answer will be, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is you would say that God and the angels are more conscious. Their consciousness is different though. So, for instance, I'm conscious of things through patterns. It's because I have learned to perceive, for instance, glasses, computers, and so on. I've learned to pick up on those patterns. It's because I have learned this that I can take the potentiality I see before me and extract patterns out of them. Like I have learned to see forms, and like this is my consciousness. My consciousness happens through those patterns. But
which actually, I wrote down one of your quotes, because I did read one of your. At least one. I think I read a couple of your papers, but I read one of them about. Okay, here it was. I think it was conscious or let's see, like seeing things as patterns or something like that. Or perception is symbolic. That's what it was.
Yeah.
But the quote was, as infants we learn to perceive simple objects and eventually people. As children we learn to perceive increasingly complex emotions in people. Later we begin to discern narratives and moral patterns. As we grow older we learn to perceive social and historical patterns. As Christians, we strive to perceive the pattern of all patterns, i.e. God.
Yeah.
That was a good touchstone to bring in, but like, well, I mean, that makes a bit of sense to me. Is it landing? Is it still landing for you, Evan? Do you have any pushback here?
You got to keep going, I think. For
Yeah, we can, because we were almost at the point of talking about like what it would be for God to be conscious of things.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm conscious of things through patterns, and it happens in time. Like I have to actually like practice to see things, and then I have to look at things to be able to perceive them, to become conscious of them. But God himself created all of those patterns and creates them at every instant, and keeps holding them into creation. Like those patterns, they don't just pop out of nowhere. They come from somewhere, and classically, they're all located in God's mind. And then, yeah, there are several arguments for this, but the basic idea is just take all of those patterns. Okay, if they exist, but they're not like material things in themselves. And you could do the same thing about matter, by the way.
When you say material, yeah, okay, you're saying matter. Yeah. They're not just potential things.
Yeah, like they don't exist just in the concrete world, for instance.
Well, that argues a little bit with our previous usage of the word matter, because if they're material, they would be exclusively potential things.
Yeah, they let's say they manifest on matter. Like the potential need. I don't even think that's true of all patterns, but okay, I think I'm gonna
I'm derailing you
to use a classic argument. I'm gonna try to use a classic argument to locate all of the patterns in God's mind. A classic argument is from Neoplatonism, and Saint Augustine used it. Is you look at the reality of abstract objects. A good example of this is mathematical objects. For instance, if you look at mathematical truths, let's say the Pythagorean theorem. Well, this theorem exists. There are people who try to deny the reality of mathematics, but lots of mathematicians do accept the reality of mathematics. If you work in mathematics, it certainly feels this way. Like if you want to make progress, you have to actually think that you're studying real things. And mathematicians will often even like describe the experience of doing mathematics as trying to almost have a kind of dialogue with like the creator of everything, like with an abstract entity that informs or contains all of the patterns. So lots of people will want to say that mathematics is real. Like it explains too much stuff. And yet, despite the fact that it exists, it's not something that depends on creation at all. Like even if there was no world, mathematics would still be true. Like the Pythagorean theorem will still exist even if there was no like known universe. It doesn't depend on matter, on the world of manifestation.
Right. So in such, then it's not a perfect description, or it can't perfectly map onto the real world. Which and the problem there, I think, is because of infinity, or because an infinity of complexity, or just as soon as you admit that infinity is even a concept, any closed system, I mean, a concept that exists within the real world, or the objective world, the world that exists, you can't. No matter how you try to describe the world, you always fall short. You always try to fit an infinite thing inside of a closed box, which is impossible.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think that's where I wanted to go exactly. Maybe. Yeah, I think I'll try to still do the classic argument. Maybe it will help, and then maybe I can bring it back to your to the point you just made. But the basic idea is, okay, once you realize that you cannot put something that is, let's say, infinite, as you said, into the finite world, once you accept that mathematical objects exist outside of creation, I should say further, they even exist outside of space and time. Like mathematical truths would still be true, even if time itself did not exist. Like before creation, you can say, if such a thing is possible to say. Like mathematical objects would still be real. And then the move that Neoplatonists do is to say that, okay, well, these mathematical truths, they exist, but they're not dependent on space and time in any way. So they must exist elsewhere than just space and time. And then they locate them in the mind of God, like into something that is outside of space and time. And typically what people put outside of space and time is God. And there are arguments for this as well. Like if something is outside of space and time, it doesn't depend on. Yeah, I don't think I'll go into all of the detailed arguments.
Okay, well, I remember there's a popular Neoplatonist in Christian apologetic circles. His name is William Lane Craig. I was forgetting his name at first. But I saw him doing a debate in South Carolina a while back, and they were talking about exactly this conversation. They were having an argument about whether or not numbers really exist. And again, we're running into that word "really," but he was sort of arguing that they do, and I think he was basically laying out this argument that you've just given, and it didn't land for me, and it still isn't landing for me, because I'll maybe try and even ask you the same question I asked him, because it seemed like, well, I mean, a lot of people asking him questions, and so he didn't have time to really, at least explain it so it made sense to me anyways. I wasn't sure that he understood the question, but probably I just didn't understand the answer. But it seems that, again, so math and mathematical objects, they don't describe, well, I guess I'm just wondering, why would you even say that they exist? Like, they're sort of shorthands for making sense of the world, but why would you say that mathematical objects, why would you say that there's actually a circle just because there's a concept of a circle, and you say it exists in the mind of God? But okay, sure. So now God is just a category for things that don't exist, but are a sort of an ideal for entities to take. So it's like, man exists in the mind of God as a potential pattern to take shape someday, but not in any I guess like so everything that's a circle, even like the mouth of this cup, it's not actually a circle, but it's sort of embodying that form of a circle. So a circle isn't really a real thing, it's a hypothetical thing.
The issue that you get if you deny the reality of those objects is that you end up undercutting yourself at some point, because you need concepts to be able to speak. You need concepts to be real to be able to speak. Because
you just need to
I took the example of
real, right?
Sorry?
You just need to sort of believe or gamble that they're real. And that's kind of my idea of faith, is just like you can't be certain about the existence of anything or anyone or any event, but you have varying levels of certainty that you can gamble on, and some of them.
Are you certain of what you just said there?
No. I'm not 100% certain, but I have a varying degrees of certainty, and so there's levels of certainty that I'm willing to bet on.
But
and some that I'm
I
not.
think it's a vacuous statement, what you just said. I mean, if you say that you have varying degrees of certainty about the world, then either you said something certain, which you can't have said something certain because then you would contradict yourself. So you said that you're uncertain about the fact that you're uncertain about things.
Right. I like I said, and it's like, obviously the argument you're making is that every time I make a statement, I'm making a manifest statement. So I'm taking away the potential for me to be saying something else, even though, I mean, this is hard to think through, but yeah, it's
not exactly my point. The point is just that you need some abstract objects that actually exist for you to be able to make meaningful statements. Like, you don't need to say that everything you say uses real categories, but you need to say that at least some of them. Like, sometimes you use real categories to speak, otherwise everything you say will be contradictory or vacuous. Like the statement you put earlier. If you say that, okay, I'm not absolutely certain of anything, well, if what you said was something true, like if you're using like if you're trying to make a completely true statement, then you would contradict yourself because you would be completely certain that you're not completely certain of anything, right, so that doesn't work.
That's the thing. So I'm not looking about mathematical truths of like, again, so that's where math again seems to disconnect from reality for me, because I think about things in terms of varying degrees of potential. It's like anything that exists is its potential in constrained by a pattern, but not totally constrained. The pattern never totally takes over and closes the system. There's always still potential, or else it stops being a thing, because a thing has to have both potential and pattern, right? And so to the extent that, okay, so anytime something becomes a thing, it's still not a closed system.
That's interesting. I wonder, I've never thought about this point. Because let's say, so I mean, it's a fairly classical point to say that, let's say, matter or potential doesn't exist by itself. Like it always has to be informed by something, or it's not real in a sense. But you still use the category to speak. So
right.
I mean that's
then
funny.
it comes back to the Heideggerian thing for me.
Yep.
It's just like, okay, it's useful to say that I believe that, because at least so now I've manifested that in sort of in a solid way, even though I can't necessarily be absolutely certain of it. I'm certain enough to say it and sort of gamble with that truth and make that statement. And then you can play with it. And then I'm still going to be humble enough to admit that I might be wrong. And later, when you prove me wrong, or I find, my consciousness gets to some new place where I can see the world in a different way, I don't have to be constrained by the way I've said things, because whenever I say things, I might be wrong, right?
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah, I think I see why you bring Heidegger back here. But let's say, okay, earlier you said that the point was, you see everything as existing as a meeting of potential and pattern, and that's okay. But then you insisted on the fact that nothing will be like totally manifest and closed off, right?
Right.
Okay. And okay, can you tell me why you want to be able to say this? Like what was the reason why you wanted to hold this?
Yeah, the reason for that statement is, I guess I'm thinking about making statements. And so when I make a statement, I'm taking ideas and I'm constraining them with the spoken word into a more specific thing. But even
okay. But I think, okay, so then it's interesting. Like so let's see we have three things. You'll have the potential, you'll have the pattern, and you'll have the meeting.
Right.
Like, do you see any of those three as real?
Well,
or you
don't
just
know
never
what
want
real
to use the word?
It just depends. Like, I can get down to just a pragmatic usage of the word real again, and then it just becomes, well, what are we trying to use real to do with? What's the value system that we're using to decide what's real? Because I mean, that's another point that really stuck out to me. I mean, Ian McGilchrist goes into this with the Master and his Emissary. It's just like a mountain only becomes a thing once you apply an ideal to it and a value system to it. It becomes, it becomes a navigational point for a sailor. It becomes something to climb, and it becomes a source of shade for somebody else. It's like it becomes something when you want to do something with it. And so things can only exist and be something when I don't know.
But I mean, you would still say that the mountains would exist even if there were new humans to look at them, right?
I mean, you wouldn't. It wouldn't necessarily be a distinct thing.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the same mountain, but there would still be something there. Like there would still be a heap of rocks and whatever.
Well, I don't know. Why would it be a heap of rocks? Because who is somebody collecting rocks?
Let's say if maybe we can try to go at this gradually. Like if you didn't exist, like you would still say that the mountain exists?
I mean, so I think it has to be interacting with some form of consciousness, which is why I kind of want that consciousness gradient. Is so maybe the mountain is a thing to a bird, or maybe even the mountain is a thing to a rock that has some sort of will.
Yeah. Well, one way to put, maybe try and bring this back to your, I think the primary reason why you brought this earlier was, okay, like things exist as a meeting of potential and pattern.
Yep.
Humans can perceive things as the meeting of pattern and potential precisely, including the mountain you just spoke about. But in God's consciousness, you have a qualitative is probably not even a strong enough word. You have an ontological jump where God not only perceives things as, let's say, through certain patterns, but you'd say that God is the ground of that matter and also the ground of those patterns. Like He creates the patterns and He creates the matter.
Right.
So while we learn to see things through patterns, God creates both of them. So like that makes His consciousness ontologically different from ours. Like what we perceive in consciousness is like one act of creation for God. So like obviously we cannot think very well about God's consciousness. It's even worse than like a child trying to think about his parents' consciousness.
Right.
But like you can at least still get an idea of the scale where, like, whereas we have to learn to perceive things through patterns, God creates patterns and matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I'm following along with this, especially this scale of, okay, if the idea is that God is more conscious, because when I was talking to my friend Andrew recently, he was saying he thinks that God is less conscious, and I still want to tease that out with him a little bit, but it seems that, okay, so if consciousness sort of scales, that like it has to do with how high and how low you can go. Yeah, that's maybe the metric for how conscious something is. It's like, and that kind of goes. I think that's a good transition point to get into the Peterson and Pageau conversation, because they start talking about Christ being, and like, so when it comes to that story, it's like, okay, so this is a being that is above all patterns. Like it's the pattern of patterns, and it descends all the way down to the bottom of material, the bottom of potential, and takes all of it and manifests it in and redeems it and you don't want to get to pantheism, because you don't want to say that God is everything, or I don't know. I wonder where you would fall on that, as far as, you know.
Yeah, it's always a touch issue, because you want to say, okay, you want to uphold a clear line between creation and creator. So let's say the pattern and the potential we talked about earlier. You want to say that God is distinct from them. God is their ground. Like they come forth from God, potential and patterns. But the goal ultimately is for this outpouring from God to all come back towards God. So you have a way I've tried to put it earlier that I think helps people understand. Hopefully you can tell me if it works. Is you distinguish between pantheism down and pantheism up. Like the danger is a kind of pantheism down where you try to bring God down to creation. You try to say that, okay, well then this ground of potential and pattern is just the potential and the pattern. This would be a pantheism down where you bring the creator down to creation.
Doesn't that ultimately lead to animism, basically?
Yeah, that's what you'd get. Okay. And that's what classical theists have always tried to reject in all great traditions. But the other way around is more hopeful, and it's sort of pantheism up, where you try to bring all of creation to God. And obviously, it's impossible for this to work correctly because you maintain a distinction between creation and creator, but you can still like try to have creation emerge as much as possible back into God. Well, you can try to have the patterns and the potential meet in ways that will most manifest where they come from.
Say that last part one more time.
Yeah, it's I think the best to understand it, rather than saying it again exactly, is to use a great reading of Genesis. If you notice in Genesis, it's exactly this pattern of, in the beginning, God creates the heavens, the patterns, and the earth. That's the matter, that's the potential. And then at each day of creation, you have a meeting of certain layers within that stuff. So you'll have like the sea, you'll have like the sky, you'll have like the fishes, you'll have the birds, and then at the end, right in smack in the middle, you'll have man. So you go, so God creates the patterns, the potential, creates all of the things in between, culminating in man. Okay, and like in all of those different days of creation where God creates some layers of being, he says that it was good. And that's creation coming back towards God. Like the potential and the patterns can meet in good ways. And we can all recognize this. There are people that we admire. There are things that we recognize as good, as meaningful, and so on. And creation is meant to do that. It's meant to be good. It's meant to manifest what it was made for. And in doing that, when every time that God says that he saw that it was good, that's creation coming back towards God. That's like an emergence of what creation was made for, what the patterns and the potential were made for. And it culminates in man, who was very good. So, and on the seventh day of creation, when God rests, that's also the same idea. It's a day to just have creation emerge back into God. It's a day where God doesn't create things. It's rather a day when things come back to God. And the good way to read this is, well, obviously, like the creation didn't happen in like 7 periods of 24 hours. It's an ontological description of what happens at every instant. At every instant, like the patterns are emanated from God, and similarly for the matter, like potential and God, God always creates all of the things in between, like it says in Genesis, and then at every instant, when things meet well, it all comes back to God. And the seventh day is like means that God is not exhausted by all of this. Like the fact that God rests means that you don't just have this matter and meeting those potentials. You also have the fact that God remains distinct, like he rests, he's not exhausted by what has happened there. And the goal is for it to all come back. So
I don't really know what you mean by coming. I guess you're giving an example of coming back as in at least God is giving it a thumbs up and saying this is the right way for this matter and pattern to manifest. But
yeah.
Okay, so where are you going with that as far as it coming back to God?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what prompted me to say this initially. Your point, initially, your first question, when I started talking about, we were talking about the scaling thing. So
yeah,
let's try to remember. So it was like how, like what's really in all of those things between matter, patterns, and meeting together. And initially, earlier, you had asked about the consciousness of God. So I tried to like explain the bridge, let's say, between in some things you have very simple meetings of patterns and potential. In the case of humans, it's bigger. In the case of God, it's like ontologically distinct because he creates those things.
It's distinct because he's created. Okay, so maybe we need to go back to the values creating reality thing again, because so every time an observer. So I was talking about the mountain, and consciousness has to be interacting with it for it to be a mountain. At least from my perspective, and so is God creating the universe in a meaningfully different way than I create the universe with my consciousness?
Yes.
Okay, so why? It's because God has caused the thing to actually. Well, I mean, I'm sort of existing here, and I don't know how I began to exist.
But this actually gets into an interesting question that
becomes this.
I don't know if it's even fully answered.
Right?
Go ahead.
Well, the difference is that I had a beginning, but I wasn't in charge of my beginning. I happened to begin based on some pattern external to me, but God is the one, the being that has no beginning, has no end.
Yeah. There are tons of differences, like the fact that you exist in time, as you just said, you have a beginning and an end, and God has neither. And like it's even further because I think that the good way to see it is, I like to put it the way that God is outside of time, not in the sense that he. Sometimes when people hear this, they think sort of as God set everything forth in motion, sort of at the beginning, and then everything sort of flew forth. But that's just a clever way of putting God at the beginning of time, putting God in time. Like when people think about putting God outside of time, it more means that like it's closer. It's not quite that, but it's closer to saying that all of creation is one instant for God. It's more like when let's say we were talking about consciousness earlier. When sometimes you'll have moments of this where you're able to compress a bunch of potential. Let's say you're trying to write something.
Yeah.
At some point, you can have a flash for what you're going to write in, let's say, the next 3 paragraphs. Like it can just sort of flash before you. You compress a bunch of time, a bunch of potential into like one moment that you'll actually, you can get the entire idea for like a novel in one instant like that. You can have like the beginning, the middle, and the end. Like you can have everything sort of spring forth in one instant. And like all of creation is kind of like that for God, where like this. So it's a big difference between, let's say, the way that we see the mountain. Like we have to learn to perceive things. Infants don't just see things outright. We have to practice. Then to actually perceive the mountain, we need to look at it as well. We cannot sort of not look at it for it to exist if we keep your framework. But doesn't apply to God. He's sort of always looking at it and creating it. There's also, I think, another big thing is that we don't create the potential at the bottom of the mountain, for instance, where let's say if I learn to perceive, let's say this glass, it's me. I get to see through the patterns, the glass as a glass, but I don't create the matter in the glass. It's I have the patterns to see it. I can sort of
you apply a pattern to it in order to describe it.
And even even maybe a good way to say it is that I'm a mediator between like the pattern and the glass. Like the glass is sort of something, the pattern of the glass is sort of something higher that I have to learn to be able to interact with. Like children can just see the glass, and I also I take the potential that is below me, like the potential that's in the glass, actually, like it's particles and fundamental fields and whatever.
Yeah.
So I mediate between that potential and the form of the glass that's above me.
And
so
but the form is based on utility, right? It's like
Yeah.
So
yeah,
but
well,
it only becomes a glass because it's useful to you for doing something. That's what I'm saying, is that
I think you can say that, yeah. But let's say for God, who creates all of the objects, he sees all of their uses as well.
Right. So it's like there's some. So it's like God's ideal. It keeps everything existing at all times because God is always observing everything, and also God has a plan for you and everything in the universe, right?
Yeah.
It's like because God has an ideal, or so it's like, so if things are created by reading a hierarchy of ideals into them, by having an aim, and God has an aim, and He can observe, and basically he can create the entire universe by having a plan for it.
Yeah. In like one flash, one story,
right,
creates everything. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
You can see that in Augustine, by the way. Like, I don't remember where he struggles with this. Like, how is it that you can relate God outside of space and time to a world that is in space and time? And like, that's the way he solves it, basically, is by saying that you sort of just have to compress things. He uses other examples, like a melody. You can, like, to actually perceive music, you have to learn to stand outside of just the individual notes. You have to be able to abstract and sort of pull it all into one moment. And like all of creation is like God seeing like one telos is going towards, and everything sort of trickles down from that.
Can you define telos?
Yeah, I think what you said earlier, I think was good. Like what's like the end of something, like what a thing is going towards. So if
okay. So
yeah.
it's like an ideal. Okay, it's an aim.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for using the Greek term. It's just like
no, that's good.
Often used in the literature, but yeah, it just means a name, like
right.
And
that helps me to then, whenever I start interacting with some of those texts that are using that word, I have a little bit of a context for it.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I know we don't have all night, and I don't want to keep you up, especially if you're getting tired.
It's good. I could still do a while. It's been interesting. I'm not tired yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me see. I kind of made a list of some things I wanted to go through with you, because I realized not everybody I have conversations with is interested in talking about this. In fact, it's hard to find somebody who wants to talk about this. So I was very excited and very looking forward to this conversation, because there were a lot of things that I've been wanting to try to process, and I guess I'm really thankful that you're willing to do this, because this has already helped me a lot to process some stuff I've been struggling to get through.
I'm happy, because so far I was afraid I was not that helpful.
No, this has definitely been helpful so far. But
okay, cool.
Let me see what else would maybe be useful to try to get to. Well, okay. Maybe we can kind of use this phrase as a touchstone, though. Maybe we've already kind of done all we can with this concept. But a phrase that kept coming up with the conversation between, and I wanted to point this out too. It was a conversation between JP and JP, and now I'm talking to JP. So that's pretty great. But they kept
so many Canadian JPs.
I know. At first, I thought I remembered your name was JP, and I was like, "Is that Jean Paul?" And if it was that would have been even better, because then there's the conversation between John Vervake and Paul Vanderklay, and you got that one too, John Paul.
Yeah.
No, it's John Vervake. Anyways, aside from the fun puns, the phrase that kept coming up is, and this is where Jordan got very emotional. He's talking about it. He says sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and somebody in the comments brought up, that's exactly what what's brought up in the book of John, of the word becomes flesh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, where the conversation went with them, and the conversation that I'm really interested in having, and that I feel something very emotional when I try to think about talking about this, because it seems like there are some stakes here, and I don't really know what to do with this conversation yet. But as far as, I mean, the question that Jordan brought up is just, why do you have to believe? Why is there such an insistence in Christian circles that the story about Christ needs to be historically true? Like to me and my practice of Christianity, the passion of the Christ is good enough for me to believe it and to act on it, even if it's only as true in a mythical sense as the story of creation or the story of Noah and the flood. It's like that's still a good enough story to inspire me to want to live the way that Christianity tells me. But it makes me struggle with different ways of interacting with Jesus within this religion and within the way Christians want to talk about Jesus, because I don't know if I think of Jesus as a concept or as a historical person or I don't know. So it's like, so what? The answer that Jonathan sort of gives is that it sort of needs to be true because of the potential of, it's like in order for all these other little stories about matter and pattern meeting and creating things, it needs to be true in the ultimate sense, and we need to see that play out on sort of the ultimate scale. At least if I'm understanding his argument right, that was sort of what he was saying, and that sounds like an interesting point, and it made me excited, maybe perk up my ears when I heard him say that, but I can't follow it through as to exactly why, because it kind of comes back to, I guess, maybe the mathematical argument about circles, about mathematical objects. Is like, I don't see why there has to be a real circle in order for there to be things that inhabit the potential of a hypothetical circle. Like, I see the reason for the myth of the circle, and I see the reason for the myth of Christ, but I don't see why there's a necessity in it being true for it to be usefully true.
Yeah, there are several ways, I think, to try to answer this. I think yeah. I have to choose sort of which way I decide to answer this. There are a few ways. One way.
Well, can I get you to go past the argument way of approaching this and be as personal with me as you can and explain to me how it makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you'll get, okay. At some point, I think what happens is, initially, for a long time, I was just trying to understand it symbolically, as I think you're doing right now. You try to sort of look at it bottom up. You try to find all kinds of examples of things close to you, whether it be like in Panpsychism or the way you perceive things. You try to use examples close to you to understand like what the story could mean for you then in your life. You try to sort of look at it bottom up, try to find something in the story of the incarnation, and then bring it back down to your life. I think if you do that enough, at some point, it's gonna be it's gonna become easy to just see the story itself and then look at the world standing from the story. So I think it's like maybe it's like trying to learn how to write. Say you're a child, you have to learn all of those like grammar rules. Like it takes years, but then at some point you're able to write. Like okay, I'm trying to write this. Like what's the rule already? And okay, I conjugate it this way and whatever. But at some point, you just have a feel for what things should feel like when they're written right.
No, I learned English. We didn't have to learn about almost any conjugation. Nothing like French.
You don't? No, yeah, in French we have tons of them. but I think, you still have some stuff you have to learn. But the basic idea is that at some point you just jump to the higher, and then you can forget like about the details of the grammar, and then by feel how things should look below, and you can even deduce then like what happens below. And the same thing happens at some point with Christianity as well. Like, I mean, of course, when I went back to church myself, like I couldn't fully believe the entire thing. I was just like, it was an exercise. I was trying to like go through my arguments and practice them as, let's say, we're saying the words and whatever, so that I could then like better embody the patterns when I go back into my own life. But at some point, I was making enough connections that it became more natural to see like creation as a reflection of God rather than the other way around. So I was able to see, for instance, that, okay, so earlier we talked about all the ways in which matter and potential can meet to create things, like this simple act of communion within creation. So rather than seeing the incarnation as, let's say, the highest scale of this process, where you have the creator coming down on creation to like incarnate, rather than starting from all of those simple examples and then going to the biggest one and then being skeptical about the reality of the biggest one, I just sort of see that the fundamental category is the biggest thing, the union between creator and creation, and everything in between is a reflection of that whole process. So I see that the world ultimately was made for the communion between creation and creator, and everything in between reflects that kind of communion. And like in practice, it does, I do think it gives me more than seeing things just symbolically. I should say just symbolically. It gives me more than if I was skeptical of their physical manifestation, for instance. It gives a very strong kind of courage, I would say. Like, obviously, I'm not a saint, and I can't fully live in the story, but like I can see, especially reading the lives of the saints, I can see a pull. I can see that it gives me very concrete courage. If, let's say, I see people who believed in the incarnation so much that they're willing to completely give their lives for it, and like not just martyrs, like also just people who have, let's say, terrible marriages, or like their spouse gets sick and then they have to take care of him or her for like 40 years. Like this kind of daily courage that I see Christians have because of the incarnation, I find that very powerful, and I like in practice, I want it for me. And I think it's viable. Like I actually think that the world makes more sense when I look at it like using the category of creator and creation with the incarnation, than if I just try to stay within the world and I'm skeptical about this story.
Yeah. Well, is it now coming back to this perception is symbolic paper? It's landing a little bit more for me, that little story that you kind of told about a child, not even being able to recognize things as an infant, and then growing and being, even as simple as being able to recognize a cup, right? Recognize the potential and the pattern meeting in that some way. And I feel like you're telling me that if, at least for you, it's started to play out as like you began to recognize God in the same way that a child eventually learns to recognize a cup, just by, I guess, interacting with adults. A child interacting with adults, he kind of almost by an osmosis learns to recognize things by spending time with Christians and higher, more spiritually conscious people. I might mature in the same way a child would, and begin to just recognize God as a thing, or as a real entity.
Yeah, I mean, I speak with people who have been living the Christian life for a long time, and like some people, it's like you think that they see God as often as they see the neighbor. Like they can always like see different actions of God around them. They can like see that if they do this, it will please or displease God or whatever. Like God becomes really like super present around them, and especially in the liturgy, that's where you get to practice it the most, for sure. But yeah, it becomes much more personal, I would say. It becomes close. Like you get to perceive. And I'm not like very far ahead on this road, but I can still get enough of it to find it delightful, I would say.
And that delight, it pushes you forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's.
I mean, it makes the world a lot more magical, and it gives a lot of very concrete like motivation for even like today I was working and it was a bit boring, but I could like put myself like in the story, especially now we're during Lent, so I could put myself during, let's say, the story of Lent and try to imagine how it is that, okay, well, Christ himself suffered in all kinds of ways. I mean, he was a carpenter for decades, just doing boring work before he got to start his ministry. So I can see,
you insert yourself in a cosmic story, sort of.
Yeah, I can see myself as, let's say, trying to mirror a cosmic story. It becomes much more meaningful. And
you mentioned magic, or that it becomes more magical. And that was something I wrote down too. I think it's Clarke's law, is what it's classically called, or it's just that anything, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that kind of relates. I mean, that was where I went to in my mind when I was listening to you guys talk about miracles with you and John and Paul. Especially when you got to the point of that, a miracle isn't something necessarily different in kind, but maybe in degree from other sorts of creative events. And that ties again to me I remember listening to, I think this is actually when we saw, Evan and I got to go and see Peterson speak live in Hamilton a couple of years ago. And he got asked this question a lot, just about how to deal with nihilism. And it becomes, it very much is that hope of miracles, essentially. He basically just said, well, your understanding of the nature of things probably isn't complete. I mean, or at least, why would you think that it is? The process.
You said that to the nihilist? I'm not sure I follow the context.
The nihilist is that, okay, so you think you've come to the conclusion that nothing has any meaning, right? Why would you be convinced by your own conclusion? Have you ever been certainly right about anything before, basically? It's basically, he kind of says, what makes you so sure you can trust your own conclusion on this? I mean, obviously some other people will come to this conclusion, but are you ready to end it there and just say, okay, you figured it out? That's kind of, it's very prideful anyways. And almost the opposite of pride is hope, is that perhaps there's a higher understanding of this that I might get to eventually, if I just continue to listen, continue to learn, or continue to kind of walk that faith journey. I mean, for you, we're kind of describing a more spiritual faith journey, but even just walking the journey of life and seeing, okay, maybe things do have meaning. You might come to realize that. But so it's just that your current understanding of things, they always, your perception of reality is always through a sort of a system, right? Your worldview is always kind of, it can sort of be identified. It's like you're condensing the world down to the limitations of the patterns that you can understand. But you can't understand, even processing
the world is much bigger.
Right, it's much bigger, and as long as you can grasp that story, there's an almost infinite amount of hope, because you never know how much more understanding you could get to, and realize that that your current understanding wasn't sufficient. It's like that there's always a miracle that exists. There's always magic that exists, because there's always something that's beyond your own understanding. And magic to describe that category of just things that you don't understand.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, and it can start small. Like, if you can start by just noticing how matter and potential meet, at small scales, and it can, at some point, you can start to realize that, and this brings it back to mathematics, but if, let's say, when I get to perceive something, like when my consciousness informs some potential, I want to say that my consciousness actually exists, this pattern exists. It's not just sort of a nihilistic illusion where everything is fundamentally just atoms and then everything on top of it is sort of abstract and doesn't really exist. If I'm able to say that that hierarchy of patterns,
just to point out the flaw in that argument really quick, I feel like that's the same trick I was talking about before about the Buddhist self ego death thing. It's just you've taken this trick you were playing about having self, and now you're saying it's a universe. You're doing that same trick to say that an atom really is a thing. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and that is the only thing. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. It's why that's so arbitrary. Why did you decide to stop there or to start there?
Yeah, and I mean, it's incoherent even for the reasons that we discussed earlier. If you're saying this, is what you're saying atoms? Your the proposition, what you just said, is it true, or is it just atomic accidents. Like should you believe yourself if it's just atoms anyways? Like Neoplatonism is making a comeback because we want those patterns to be real. And it goes back to why I like the idea of saying that even mathematical truths exist, like even outside of creation, because if I get to say that they're real, like I'm that much more convinced that my consciousness is real because it's another pattern. I want all of those layers of patterns to be real so that I can say meaningful things, so that my consciousness exists, so that ultimately, like, I have a whole coherent hierarchy where I can see how the world is made of nested layers of potential and of patterns, and ultimately, like, behind all of that is a God who is beyond pattern and potential altogether.
Beyond it. Okay. Well, maybe we can come back there. I guess one thing I wanted to hit real quick is just as you were explaining that, you said, I want to be able to say this. And and that to me, the way I heard Brett Weinstein kind of sum this up is just that, like, so I like it because, and this is sort of the way I've been dealing with belief as well. It's just that it is sort of a gamble, but the bang you get for your buck when you say that things really exist is everything. Suddenly, now you have things that you can do things with, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's again, you don't get to have. I don't think all you get is that want to be able to do something with everything, or to be able to have objects that you can play with. Like, in order to do anything, you need to confine it to a system, and so you get a lot of, again, you get a lot of bang for your buck for doing that. But it's still within that, you still have to have that open system thing where you realize, okay, I'm still bargaining on a particular system that I've reduced the world to, and it's not real, but it's real enough that I can. It's working to predict things, so it works. It's real enough for now, and maybe I can get more real.
Yeah. I think it's like if you do enough philosophy, at some point you realize that it comes down to different intuitions about different things. Like, the best you can do is you try to make, like, all of the arguments clear. You try to see, okay, well, this guy goes that way and this guy goes that way, and they do so because they have different intuitions about this problem.
Right.
And then, like, really, philosophy is a complex map with, like, different paths that depend on different intuitions. And then, like, you basically pick what you think works best. And like, once you've picked what you think works best, then you can explore in that. And at some point, you get a better idea of the map, and then you can reassess. Okay, where do I want to change my intuitions in some places? But, like, if you don't commit to, like, some intuitions somewhere, you'll just never explore, and you'll never get anywhere.
Well, that's the nihilism thing. It's like it's you've become overwhelmed by the idea that you're going to be wrong no matter what thing you commit to, and so you're just like, well, that means I'm just wrong, so I'm not going to bother committing to anything. Well, no, if you commit to a wrong thing, you might be less wrong than being totally wrong, and just being satisfied with being totally wrong. As long as there's a gradient there, then you get the concept of hope again.
Yeah, you'll see some small magic. You'll see, like, you'll notice that you were wrong at some point, and then the world will reenchant at some point. And it can start super small, like just from going to nihilism to admitting that consciousness exists.
Right.
Like, that's a huge jump. Like,
Yeah.
you
Suddenly you have the whole
added
world
just
back.
a bunch of layers to your ontology.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let me see if maybe we should wrap things up, but let me just see if there's any more avenues we should try to go down.
Yeah, if you see something we can talk about within, let's say, 5-10 minutes, it would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like it's been useful. I'm much more confident about being useful on that last answer than I was for the first, like, hour and a half of our conversation.
Great. Okay, well, I was going to say something about, well, you know, I'll save that for book club. Let's talk about just church, I guess, because I think this might be a good way to end, because I feel like you might have a good sort of answer to this question, but I guess thinking about going to church makes me almost sick. Like, I just don't want to do it.
That's so common.
I'm not sure if it's just bad experiences or it's... I feel like I'm just going to be so deeply misunderstood, and so I'm going to have to sit through so much sort of nonsense, or so much... Like, one of the most important things about church seems to me to be relationship, and I don't. It feels like any church that I have access to, I don't have access to a community or relationships where I really feel like, I could have that cool consciousness melding thing where I could become part of a body. And maybe that's just more a me being too specific about the sort of body I want to go and be part of. But I don't know. So you obviously said you related to that sensation. How did you get past that? How did you decide to go and pick a church? Did you change churches? Did you look for different communities? Did you shop around?
I didn't shop around that much. I think one thing that helped, honestly, is I think that I had been doing jiu-jitsu for a while before, so I saw it similarly. I saw it that, okay, I'm gonna get in there and I'm gonna get my ass kicked. I'm not gonna understand what goes on. I'm gonna be confused. I'm not gonna be like, I'm not gonna like this, but I'm confident that the process will bear fruit. So that was my attitude to start with, and I also saw it as incremental. Like if you start training in anything, you don't want to sort of go balls out right from the start. You'll burn out or you'll get injured or something. So initially, like I was raised Catholic, so I could just sort of go back to church and participate in the sacraments. So I just went back to a church nearby, didn't talk to anyone, just sort of tried to take in the liturgy for a while. And then at some point I heard about a church that was probably better for young people. It was a bit further away, but I thought it was worth going. So I just went. And then still I didn't talk to anyone really for a few months. And at some point when I felt I had more time, decided to get involved in something that looked interesting. Like it's something to do with younger people who were probably interested in philosophy and stuff. So I thought this would probably be a good idea to start, got involved in that, and progressively it worked. But I think what happens, and I'm not sure, I don't know enough about your city, for instance, but like I'm sure there's a way to do it progressively. Like if you can find a church that has interesting enough liturgy that you can just go there and then try to live the symbolism. It can even just be an intellectual puzzle at first. Like I remember I went there, I would sort of, I didn't often like the sermons that were given initially, so I just like I would just read the readings for the day, and then I would just sort of just meditate on them and think on them and like try to find the symbolism in there. I would try to see the symbolism in like the architecture, in the liturgy that we're doing, in the chants and so on. It would be a quite intellectual exercise at first, but like you just work your way up. Like you're a white belt, you don't know anything, so you just keep working at it, and then like it makes more sense and it gets better. And then at some point you're able to talk with people and you can somewhat understand them. And it's like at first, like people are talking Christianese and you don't understand really what they're saying, and like they don't understand you that well, so you have to make an effort. But like at some point you start to build bridges with some people. You'll notice people who like you can talk to more easily than others, and like it gets better with time. So I just really saw it as I'm gonna go do jiu-jitsu and it's gonna take years before I get any good at it, but that's okay because progress is what matters.
Right. And that is, yeah. I guess I already have the prerequisites necessary because a part of me really does think it's worth it. But I think your story, that sounds interesting to me as far as just deciding where to start that journey, because I think I've become very disenchanted, at least with my own tradition.
What tradition is it, by the way?
Well, I mean, I grew up in mostly Pentecostal and evangelical circles, and so it's almost like I feel like it's too fundamentalist of a version of Christianity that I feel like I've almost sucked it dry of what it has to offer me, and I want to be re-enchanted with Christianity, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I mean the typical move for people in this corner of the internet is to become Orthodox, or at least Roman Catholic. So I mean, if those options are available to you, you can just go and like talk to people. And especially, you'll probably find some like well-informed priests or like some people there. I don't know how big the city you live in is. You told me earlier, but I don't remember.
Yeah,
like I don't know the size.
I live in
of
a
the
village actually, so it's
a village,
very small. But there actually are two. I'm not sure actually what denomination they are, but they're at least they don't look like evangelical churches. They look pretty. So it looks like there's something there that we were missing.
But yeah, I mean, in those cases, you have something clear to start with, and yeah, it's different enough to be. It's rich enough to be reenchanted. But yeah, it's hard for me to say about people who are in a tradition that they don't like at all, or that they feel like they've sucked dry. Because I don't want to just sort of speak against other traditions as well. I know people who, let's say, were already involved at their church, and they just kept being involved, but now they add all of this symbolic understanding that they could bring into their church, and this has had good fruits on their churches. But I don't know about people completely going back.
To some extent, I feel that sort of that calling, that responsibility to, I mean, especially just even to my family, because they're very active in this community, and it's like I don't want to just go and be part of something different, because I am already part of something, and it's there's an identity there. There's a there's an angel that's come into existence that I'm part of, which I mean, even that terminology is something that's not at all not at all conceivable, or at least that's not the way evangelicals talk, right?
I think that's what's going to be tough for you if you go there. And I mean, I had something analogous on my end as well, because initially I wasn't familiar with the classical tradition. I wasn't familiar with Neoplatonism and St. Thomas Aquinas and like all of this tradition. I was still very much a panpsychist initially, so I was not talking the same language sort of out of the box as people were there. So like I had to learn to speak the language, and similarly they would learn to speak mine, and it wasn't obvious, but like they are still, and especially I don't want to just sort of go in there and like start preaching to people. Like you have to like do it this way that I've learned and so on. But like there's still always ways. There are still always ways to find like common ground. They like at the very least, if you use biblical categories, you're gonna understand. Like you probably won't be able to just sort of copy paste what you see on the symbolic world, but still, like there are ways to get around it. Like you need to sort of learn their categories and then try to speak with them. And at some point, people like trust you too, so they're more likely to listen to what you're doing and so on. And yeah, I think it's definitely possible, but it's not like a quick fix thing. It's more like a 3-4 years kind of thing.
And it might be even, I mean, that process of what you're talking about is that you need to sort of translate. I was thinking about this before. I've only ever spoken one language at a time, but I was listening to this conversation between Lex Fridman and Michael Malice, and he mentioned that like there's something different that happens when you're bilingual, because you become able to transcend the language and think about the concepts, because languages always limit concepts in different ways, right? And so you have access at least to that realization that the language is always grasping at a concept. But in order to speak, you need to constrain yourself to a particular language, to particular words, and those words are always imperfect. And I guess in order to be a Christian, you need to constrain yourself to a particular tradition, a particular denomination, even though that denomination isn't imperfect, and try to take those patterns and incarnate them in a form that makes sense and is meaningful to that community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you can always sort of reassess at some point. Initially, I thought I would become Orthodox at some point, but I ended up finding a home in my own tradition. But like, you can commit to something for a while and then like reassess. But you may find that you're already at home. It's hard to predict these things.
Like I can at least say thanks, because that gives me some hope.
My pleasure. This was fun. I think this was very useful for me, especially to try and explain things in a way that is different from what I typically do. It's funny because Jonathan and I come from a different background. He's more artistic, phenomenology, and so on. I'm more art sciences and classical filmism, let's say. So like we come from different backgrounds, and some makes it interesting for me to try and convey my ideas differently.
Great. Well, I'm glad you found this meaningful too, because I was afraid I was just leeching on you a little bit.
Yeah, I was afraid that I was just like not useful.
Well, again, thank you, man. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, this was fun. yeah, let's keep in touch. I'll be curious to know what happens with your experiences back in churches, hopefully.
Definitely. All right, man. Thanks again.
All right. Bye, Garrett.
Bye. Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe, like the video. Any kind of engagement really helps out with algorithm stuff as far as I'm aware. Another thing I'd love if you would do would be to share this video with someone who you think might find it interesting or specifically might disagree with it about something or disagree with you about something, and use it as a launch pad to have an interesting conversation, have an interesting disagreement maybe, because that's really what this whole thing is about for me. I think that having, honest disagreements is a really useful and meaningful thing to do. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.